He thought she was nothing. He thought she was just a broke waitress he had graciously lifted from the gutters of desperation. Alexander Donovan, a ruthless real estate mogul from downtown Chicago, strode into that divorce courthouse on Maple Street with the swagger of a man who owned half the city, which, frankly, he did. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor like a countdown timer to what he believed would be his wife's complete destruction. Behind him, giggling like a schoolgirl despite being 28, was his mistress Scarlett Hayes, a wannabe social media influencer whose greatest achievement was getting verified on Instagram by dating rich men. Alexander was ready for war. He had his ammunition loaded, a prenuptial agreement tighter than Fort Knox, financial records that painted his wife as a charity case, and the best divorce attorney money could buy. His plan was simple and brutal: leave his wife Anastasia with absolutely nothing but a bus ticket back to whatever small town she crawled out of. But Alexander Donovan made one catastrophic miscalculation that would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. He never bothered to investigate the woman he had been married to for 7 years. He never asked the right questions. He never wondered why the broke waitress spoke 5 languages fluently, why she never seemed impressed by his wealth, or why she carried herself with an elegance that money couldn't buy. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. What Alexander didn't know, what his arrogance had blinded him to completely, was that the woman he was about to humiliate in front of a packed courtroom wasn't just some random girl he had rescued from poverty. Anastasia Volkov wasn't even her real name. The quiet, unassuming woman who had spent 7 years cooking his meals, ironing his shirts, and tolerating his increasingly cruel treatment was actually Her Royal Highness Princess Katerina Elizaveta Romanova, the sole heir to the Romanova dynasty and owner of one of the largest private banks in Eastern Europe. Hey Toxic Truths family! I am very thankful to Phyllis Ashby, who bought a membership for this channel. She is also the first member of this channel. I am very pleased with you. If you also want me to make a community post about you and talk about you using your name, please buy a membership and send me a super gift. This is very helpful to me in making interesting videos for you. Thank you. One more thing. Don't miss any of today's videos because today's videos are very interesting. Now continue the video. When those courthouse doors would swing open in exactly 43 minutes, and the royal guard of the Principality of Valdoria would march in wearing their distinctive crimson and gold uniforms, Alexander's world wouldn't just crumble, it would be obliterated so completely that archaeologists wouldn't be able to find the pieces. This is the story of the most spectacular divorce court karma in recorded history, a tale so unbelievable that if you saw it in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and call it unrealistic. The morning of October 15th started like any other day for Alexander Donovan. He woke up in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the same penthouse he had bought with money borrowed from offshore accounts he thought were untraceable. He performed his usual morning routine, a $300 skincare regimen, a workout with his personal trainer, and a breakfast prepared by his private chef. Everything in his life was calculated to project success and dominance. His watch was a limited edition Patek Philippe, worth more than most people's houses. His suit was custom-tailored by the same Savile Row tailor who dressed British royalty, though Alexander had no idea how ironic that detail would become. As he adjusted his platinum cufflinks, Alexander couldn't help but smirk at his reflection. Today was the day he would finally cut loose the dead weight that had been dragging him down for years. Anastasia had served her purpose. She had been the perfect, submissive wife while he built his empire. But now that he had reached the top of Chicago's social ladder, he needed a woman who matched his status. Someone young, beautiful, and Instagram-worthy. Someone like Scarlett, who understood that being seen was more important than being genuine. What Alexander failed to realize was that his submissive wife had been quietly documenting every single one of his illegal business dealings for the past 3 years. Every offshore account, every tax evasion scheme, every bribe paid to city officials to get his building permits approved, Anastasia had copies of everything. But she wasn't just a woman scorned seeking revenge. She was a trained diplomat who had been educated at Cambridge and the Sorbonne, someone who understood international law better than most attorneys, and someone who had been playing a game of chess while Alexander thought they were playing checkers. The courthouse on Maple Street had seen its share of dramatic divorces, but nothing could have prepared Judge Patricia Holloway for what was about to unfold in her courtroom. She had reviewed the case files the night before, a straightforward divorce between a wealthy real estate developer and his apparently penniless wife. The man wanted everything. The woman couldn't even afford proper legal representation. It seemed like it would be over before lunch. But as Alexander Donovan walked through those courthouse doors, flanked by his team of expensive lawyers and his giggling mistress, he had no idea that he was walking into the most elaborate trap ever set in a divorce court. He had no idea that the woman he had spent 7 years belittling and undermining was about to reveal herself as one of the most powerful people in the Northern Hemisphere. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, he would be begging for mercy from the same woman he had planned to destroy. This is that story. Buckle up, because you're not going to believe how this ends. Alexander Donovan was the kind of man who measured his worth in zeros. The more trailing behind the first digit of his net worth, the more superior he felt to the rest of humanity. At 39, he stood 6'2" with a kind of artificially perfect smile that came from $50,000 worth of dental work and a jawline that had been subtly enhanced by Chicago's most discreet plastic surgeon. His thick, dark hair was always impeccably styled, though he'd never admit to the monthly $800 treatments that kept it looking naturally full. The Donovan empire had been built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and questionable ethics. Alexander specialized in what he euphemistically called urban renewal, buying up entire city blocks in low-income neighborhoods, evicting the families who had lived there for generations, and constructing luxury condominiums that only the wealthy could afford. He had perfected the art of bribing city officials, manipulating zoning laws, and using legal loopholes to destroy communities while lining his own pockets. His company, Donovan Development Group, had displaced over 3,000 families in the past decade, but Alexander saw this as progress, not destruction. His office occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave him a god's-eye view of the city he was systematically transforming. The walls were lined with awards from business organizations that celebrated his innovative approach to urban development, though none of them mentioned the homeless shelters that had to triple their capacity because of his projects. His desk was a massive slab of black granite that had been imported from Italy at a cost of $75,000, more than most families made in a year. Alexander's daily routine was a masterclass in narcissism. He started each morning with a personal trainer who came to his penthouse at 5 a.m. sharp. Not because Alexander particularly cared about fitness, but because physical dominance was another way to assert his superiority over others. His breakfast was prepared by a chef who had trained at Le Cordon Bleu, though Alexander rarely tasted the food. He was too busy scrolling through articles about himself in the Chicago Business Journal or checking his stock portfolio to appreciate the artistry. By 7 a.m., Alexander was in his private car, a custom Bentley that cost more than most people's houses, being driven to work by his personal chauffeur, Marcus Thompson. Marcus had been with the company for 12 years, and Alexander treated him like a piece of furniture, never bothering to learn that Marcus had 3 children or that his wife was battling cancer. To Alexander, service staff weren't people, they were extensions of his own importance. The Donovan Development Group offices were designed to intimidate. The lobby featured a waterfall that cost $2 million to install and maintain, not because Alexander liked water features, but because the sound of flowing water made it difficult for visitors to eavesdrop on conversations. His employees lived in constant fear of his legendary temper tantrums, which could be triggered by anything from a typo in an email to a secretary wearing shoes that Alexander deemed too casual for his standards. Alexander's relationship with money wasn't about security or comfort, it was about power. He kept detailed records of every person who owed him favors, every politician he had bought, and every competitor he had crushed. His office safe contained not just cash and important documents, but also compromising photographs and recorded conversations that he used as leverage against anyone who dared to cross him. Blackmail wasn't just a tool in Alexander's arsenal, it was practically an art form. What made Alexander particularly dangerous was his complete lack of empathy. He genuinely believed that poor people deserved their circumstances because they lacked the intelligence and drive to improve their situations. He had never experienced real hardship, never worried about paying rent or buying groceries, never had to choose between heating his home and buying medicine. His privilege had been so absolute for so long that he couldn't even conceive of a world where he wasn't the most important person in any room. This worldview extended to his marriage. Alexander had met Anastasia 7 years ago at a small jazz club in the Arts District, a neighborhood he was planning to demolish for a new shopping complex. She had been working there as a hostess, and Alexander had been immediately attracted to what he saw as her simplicity and naivety. Here was a woman who didn't want anything from him except his attention, who seemed genuinely impressed by his success rather than entitled to it like the other wealthy women in his social circle. The courtship had been swift and calculated. Alexander enjoyed playing the role of the generous benefactor, swooping in to rescue a beautiful woman from a life of poverty. He paid off her student loans, though she had tried to tell him they were unnecessary, moved her into his penthouse, and began molding her into his vision of the perfect wife. Someone who would look beautiful at business dinners but never speak unless spoken to. Someone who would manage his household but never question his decisions. Someone who would be grateful for his generosity rather than demanding equality in their relationship. For 7 years, Alexander believed he had found exactly what he wanted. Anastasia cooked elaborate meals, maintained his social calendar, and never complained when he worked 16-hour days or disappeared for weekend business trips that she wasn't invited to join. She seemed content with the allowance he gave her for household expenses, never asking for expensive jewelry or designer clothes like his friends' wives did. She was, in Alexander's mind, the perfect investment, low maintenance but high return in terms of his social status and domestic comfort. But perfection, Alexander was about to learn, can sometimes be the most dangerous illusion of all. Anastasia Volkov sat quietly in the back of the yellow taxi as it pulled up to the Cook County Courthouse, her hands folded neatly in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for detention. To any observer, she looked exactly like what Alexander had always claimed she was, a woman defeated by circumstances beyond her control, someone who had never quite belonged in the world of wealth and privilege that her husband inhabited. Her appearance had been carefully crafted over the past 7 years to project exactly this image, and today would be the final performance of the greatest acting role of her life. She wore a faded navy blue cardigan that she had purchased from a thrift store on purpose 3 years ago, not because she couldn't afford better, but because every detail of her persona had to be authentic. The cardigan was slightly too large for her petite frame, giving her the appearance of someone who had lost weight from stress or simply couldn't afford properly fitted clothing. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an elastic band that cost 50 cents, though the hair itself had been maintained by one of Europe's finest stylists during her monthly visits to her sick aunt, that Alexander never questioned. Her shoes were sensible black flats with worn soles, shoes she had actually walked hundreds of miles in throughout Chicago's neighborhoods, not because she had to, but because she had been conducting her own investigation into her husband's business practices. Every scuff mark on those shoes represented another property Alexander had illegally seized, another family he had displaced, another bribe he had paid to city officials. She had walked those streets, talked to those displaced families, and documented every single crime Alexander thought he had committed in secret. The taxi driver, a kind elderly man named Robert, tried to make conversation as they approached the courthouse. "Big day today, miss? You look nervous." His concern was genuine. Anastasia had the appearance of someone heading toward her own execution rather than a divorce proceeding. "Something like that," Anastasia replied softly, her voice carrying just the right amount of resignation mixed with quiet determination. Even her voice had been carefully modulated over the years. Her natural speaking voice was crisp and authoritative, the result of years of diplomatic training and education at the finest universities in Europe. But Anastasia Volkov spoke with the slightly hesitant cadence of someone who had learned to make herself smaller, to take up less space in rooms dominated by more powerful personalities. As she paid the taxi fare with carefully counted bills from a worn leather wallet, Anastasia reflected on the 7-year performance that had brought her to this moment. Every morning, she had woken up in Alexander's penthouse and played the role of the grateful wife. She had learned to flinch slightly when he raised his voice, not because she was afraid of him, but because it reinforced his belief that he held all the power in their relationship. She had learned to defer to his opinions at dinner parties, even when he was spouting complete nonsense about topics she knew more about than anyone else in the room. The irony was almost delicious. While Alexander believed he was educating his simple wife about the finer things in life, Anastasia had been born into a world that made his wealth look like pocket change. She had grown up in palaces that were older than the entire city of Chicago, had been tutored by Nobel Prize winners and Olympic champions, and had been conducting diplomatic negotiations since she was 16 years old. But Alexander had never bothered to truly listen when she spoke, never asked probing questions about her past, never wondered why she seemed so comfortable in luxury despite supposedly coming from poverty. Her legal representation was perhaps the most brilliant aspect of her long-term strategy. Samuel Peterson was a 73-year-old attorney who ran a small practice specializing in family law for middle-class clients. His office was in a converted house in a modest neighborhood, his suits came from department stores, and his briefcase looked like it had survived several wars. Alexander and his team of corporate lawyers would look at Samuel and see exactly what they expected to see: an overmatched public defender trying to do his best for a hopeless case. What they wouldn't see was that Samuel Peterson had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and had spent 30 years as one of Washington, D.C.'s most feared divorce attorneys before retiring to Chicago for a quieter life. He had come out of retirement specifically for this case, not because Anastasia needed the best legal representation money could buy, but because she needed legal representation that would be underestimated until it was too late. Samuel had spent the past 6 months preparing for this case with the thoroughness of a general planning a military campaign. Hidden in his battered briefcase were documents that would systematically dismantle every aspect of Alexander's business empire, financial records that proved his connection to offshore accounts, and recordings that would expose his corruption to federal investigators. But all of that preparation was hidden behind the facade of a tired old man who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. As Anastasia walked up the courthouse steps, she noticed the news van parked across the street. A reporter and cameraman were setting up equipment, though they seemed bored rather than excited. This appeared to be a routine assignment: cover a divorce case involving a prominent businessman, file a basic story about the proceedings, move on to more interesting news. They had no idea they were about to witness one of the most spectacular legal reversals in the court's history. The courthouse itself was an imposing building constructed in the 1920s, with marble columns and brass fixtures that spoke of a time when civic architecture was designed to inspire respect for the law. As she passed through the metal detectors, Anastasia nodded politely to the security guards who had become familiar faces during her visits to research public records. They knew her as the quiet woman who spent hours in the public records office, someone they assumed was doing research for a small law firm or writing a book about local history. Judge Patricia Holloway's courtroom was exactly what central casting would order for a dramatic legal proceeding. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and the kind of formal atmosphere that made people instinctively lower their voices. Anastasia took her seat at the defendant's table next to Samuel Peterson, who was arranging his papers with the methodical care of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times before. The gallery was sparsely populated: a few court watchers, the board reporter, and a small group of Alexander's business associates who had come to watch him destroy his inconvenient wife. They whispered among themselves about how quickly this would all be over, how Alexander would finally be free to marry someone more appropriate to his social status. What none of them could have imagined was that they were about to witness the carefully orchestrated downfall of one of Chicago's most powerful men, executed by the woman he had spent 7 years treating as his intellectual and social inferior. The mahogany doors of courtroom 7B swung open with the weight of impending doom, though only one person in the room truly understood what was about to unfold. Alexander Donovan entered like a conquering general surveying territory he had already claimed, his $8,000 Armani suit perfectly pressed and his confidence radiating with the intensity of a small sun. Behind him marched his legal army: Marcus Stone, the lead attorney whose reputation for destroying opposing parties in divorce proceedings was legendary throughout Illinois; Jennifer Walsh, a sharp-eyed financial analyst whose job was to ensure that every asset remained firmly in Alexander's control; and David Chen, a private investigator who specialized in digging up dirt on inconvenient spouses. Marcus Stone was exactly the kind of lawyer that Alexander's money could buy: ruthless, brilliant, and completely devoid of any moral compass that might interfere with victory. At 52, Stone had built his career on the principle that divorce was war and anything less than total annihilation of the opposing party was failure. His silver hair was slicked back with expensive pomade, his steel-gray eyes missed nothing, and his handshake could crush bones. He charged $1,200 per hour and was worth every penny to clients who wanted their problems to disappear permanently. "Today is going to be a massacre," Stone murmured to Alexander as they took their seats at the plaintiff's table. "I've reviewed her financials, her employment history, her credit score. She's got nothing. No assets, no income, no family money. The prenup you insisted on 7 years ago is airtight, and even if she tries to claim emotional distress or domestic abuse, we've got character witnesses lined up to testify that you're a model husband." Alexander nodded with satisfaction, adjusting his platinum cufflinks, a nervous habit that emerged whenever he was particularly excited about crushing someone beneath his designer shoes. "What about her lawyer? Should I be concerned about this Peterson character?" Stone barely suppressed a laugh. "Samuel Peterson? The guy's a fossil. He runs a 2-person practice out of a converted house and drives a 15-year-old Honda. I've researched his recent cases, mostly custody disputes and uncontested divorces for middle-class families. He's probably taking this case pro bono because he feels sorry for her. I could destroy him with my law school notes." The strategy session that had taken place in Alexander's office the previous week had been a masterclass in tactical cruelty. Stone had laid out their approach with military precision. First, establish that Anastasia had contributed nothing to the marriage financially or socially. Second, demonstrate that her background was questionable at best and fraudulent at worst. Third, prove that Alexander had been overly generous in supporting someone who was clearly using him for his money. And finally, paint her as a gold digger who deserved nothing more than a bus ticket back to whatever small town she had crawled out of. Jennifer Walsh, the financial analyst, had prepared a devastating presentation showing Alexander's net worth, approximately $150 million in real estate holdings, stocks, and business interests, contrasted with Anastasia's apparent poverty. Bank records showed that she had never contributed a single dollar to their joint accounts, never owned property, never invested in stocks or bonds. Her only income during their 7-year marriage had been the household allowance Alexander provided, which she had spent on groceries, cleaning supplies, and the occasional thrift store purchase. "It's almost too easy," Walsh had told the team during their preparation meeting. "She's been completely dependent on him for everything. No career, no education credentials we can verify, no family wealth. She's the perfect example of someone who married for money and now wants to cash out." David Chen, the private investigator, had spent 3 months trying to dig up dirt on Anastasia's past, and his findings had only reinforced their confidence. "She claims to be from some small town in Eastern Europe," he had reported, "but the immigration records are spotty. No college transcripts, no professional references, no social media presence before she met Alexander. Either she's incredibly boring or she's hiding something embarrassing. Either way, it works in our favor." The prenuptial agreement was their ultimate weapon, and Stone had spent hours reviewing every clause with the satisfaction of a chess master contemplating checkmate. 7 years earlier, when Alexander had been worth a mere $20 million and paranoid about gold diggers, he had insisted on the most restrictive prenup his lawyers could draft. The document was 43 pages of legal language that essentially stated that what was his remained his, and what was hers, well, she had brought nothing into the marriage, so she would leave with nothing. "She signed it without even reading it," Alexander had bragged to his friends at the time. "I told her it was just a formality, and she trusted me completely. That's the difference between smart people and naive people. We protect ourselves, they rely on good intentions." As they waited for the proceedings to begin, Alexander's team reviewed their talking points one final time. They would paint Anastasia as a woman who had never worked a day in her life, who had spent 7 years living in luxury at Alexander's expense, who had contributed nothing to his success but had enjoyed all the benefits of his hard work. They would question her mysterious background, her lack of family connections, her suspicious inability to provide detailed information about her life before meeting Alexander. Stone had prepared a series of character witnesses who would testify that Alexander was a generous, patient husband who had tried everything to encourage his wife to be more social, more ambitious, more worthy of the opportunities he had provided. These witnesses, mostly Alexander's business associates and their wives, would describe Anastasia as withdrawn, ungrateful, and possibly unstable. They would suggest that Alexander had been trapped in a marriage with someone who couldn't appreciate his success or contribute to his continued growth. The plan was to keep the proceedings short and brutal. Present the evidence of Alexander's success and Anastasia's dependence, enforce the prenuptial agreement, and walk away with everything intact. Stone estimated the entire process would take less than 3 hours, leaving Alexander free to celebrate his victory with a champagne lunch at the Chicago club. "Remember," Stone told his client as Judge Holloway entered the courtroom, "show no emotion when she tries to make her pathetic case. Let her humiliate herself with whatever sob story she's prepared, then we'll finish her off with facts and legal documents. By this afternoon, you'll be a free man with all your assets protected." Alexander straightened his tie and prepared to watch his wife's complete destruction, never suspecting that he was actually the one walking into a trap that had been 7 years in the making. Across the aisle, Anastasia sat quietly beside her elderly lawyer, her hands folded, her expression serene. To everyone watching, she looked like a lamb being led to slaughter. But if they had looked more carefully at her eyes, they might have noticed something that would have terrified them: the calm, patient gaze of a predator who had been waiting a very long time for her prey to walk into the perfect killing ground. Judge Patricia Holloway called the court to order with a sharp bang of her gavel, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations that had been rippling through the gallery. At 61, Judge Holloway had presided over more than 3,000 divorce cases during her 25-year career on the bench, and she prided herself on being able to read the dynamics of a case within the first 10 minutes of testimony. Today's case seemed straightforward enough: a wealthy businessman seeking to divorce his apparently impoverished wife while protecting his substantial assets through what appeared to be an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Case number 2023, D-4847, Donovan v. Volkov, Judge Holloway announced, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the preliminary filings. "Counsel, please state your appearances for the record." Marcus Stone rose from the plaintiff's table with the fluid confidence of a man who had never lost a case that mattered. Marcus Stone of Stone, Williams and Associates, representing the plaintiff, Alexander Donovan, Your Honor. Samuel Peterson stood more slowly, his aged joints creaking audibly in the quiet courtroom. Samuel Peterson, representing the defendant, Anastasia Volkov, Your Honor. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of decades of courtroom experience that most observers in the room couldn't begin to appreciate. "Mr. Stone, you may proceed with your opening statement," Judge Holloway instructed, settling back in her chair with the expression of someone expecting a routine morning's work. Stone approached the bench with theatrical precision, his every movement calculated to project authority and inevitability. "Your Honor, this case is about protecting the rights of a hard-working American businessman who built his fortune through intelligence, determination, and legal business practices, only to find himself trapped in a marriage with a woman who has contributed nothing to his success and now seeks to profit from his generosity." As Stone began his methodical destruction of Anastasia's character and circumstances, he was completely unaware that his every word was being recorded by devices hidden throughout the courtroom, devices that had been legally planted there 3 months earlier as part of a federal investigation that Alexander knew nothing about. Every false statement, every deliberately misleading characterization, every attempt to conceal assets would become evidence in a much larger criminal case that was already building against Alexander and his business empire. "The evidence will show," Stone continued, his voice rising with practiced indignation, "that Mrs. Volkov, if that is indeed her real name, entered this marriage under false pretenses. She claimed to be a simple working woman seeking love and companionship, but her actions over the past 7 years tell a different story entirely. She has lived a life of complete luxury at my client's expense, contributing nothing to the household income, refusing to work or pursue education, and showing no gratitude whatsoever for the opportunities Mr. Donovan has provided." In the gallery, Several of Alexander's business associates nodded approvingly. They had heard these complaints before during Alexander's increasingly frequent rants about his ungrateful wife. What they didn't know was that Anastasia had been documenting those very same rants, along with the illegal business discussions that often followed them when Alexander thought he was among trusted friends. Stone presented his evidence with the efficiency of a machine designed for destruction: bank records showing Anastasia's lack of financial contribution, employment records showing her sporadic work history before meeting Alexander, and character testimony from Alexander's friends describing her as withdrawn, antisocial, and possibly mentally unstable. Each piece of evidence was designed to paint the picture of a woman who had successfully deceived a generous man and now sought to profit from her deception. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Stone said, producing a thick legal document with theatrical flourish, "we have the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties 7 years ago, clearly stating that each party shall retain ownership of all assets brought into or acquired during the marriage. Mrs. Volkov brought no assets into this marriage, and under the terms of this legally binding agreement, she has no claim to any assets acquired by Mr. Donovan during their union." Judge Holloway accepted the prenuptial agreement for review, noting its impressive length and apparent thoroughness. 43 pages of legal language that seemed to cover every possible contingency, except, as she would soon discover, the one contingency that actually mattered. When Stone concluded his opening statement, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy with the expectation of inevitable defeat for the defense. Alexander supporters in the gallery were already mentally planning their congratulatory lunch, while the court reporter looked bored by what appeared to be a routine asset protection case. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Holloway said, "you may present your opening statement for the defense." The elderly lawyer rose slowly from his chair, and for a moment, the courtroom was completely silent except for the soft shuffle of his papers and the distant sound of traffic from Michigan Avenue. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a strange undertone that made Judge Holloway lean forward slightly. "Your Honor," Peterson began, "my client has listened patiently to Mr. Stone's characterization of her marriage and her character. She has heard herself described as a gold digger, a fraud, and a woman of questionable background. She has been accused of deception, laziness, and ingratitude." Peterson paused, reaching into his battered briefcase to withdraw a single manila folder that looked completely ordinary compared to Stone's elaborate presentation materials. "But before we proceed with this case, Your Honor, I believe there are certain facts about my client's identity and circumstances that the court should be aware of, facts that Mr. Donovan never bothered to investigate during their 7-year marriage." Something in Peterson's tone made Alexander shift uncomfortably in his chair. The old man's voice had subtly changed, losing its hesitant quality and gaining an edge of authority that seemed to fill the courtroom like gathering storm clouds. "Mr. Stone has questioned my client's background, suggesting that her history is somehow suspicious or fabricated," Peterson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He is correct that Mrs. Volkov's background is not what it appears to be. However, the truth is not what Mr. Donovan assumed when he married her." Judge Holloway noticed that Anastasia had straightened slightly in her chair, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she was looking directly at her husband instead of keeping her eyes downcast. "Your Honor," Peterson said, opening the manila folder with deliberate care, "I would like to request a brief recess to allow for the arrival of certain witnesses who can properly authenticate my client's true identity and legal status." "What kind of witnesses, Mr. Peterson?" Judge Holloway asked, her curiosity clearly piqued. "Diplomatic witnesses, Your Honor. Representatives of a foreign government who can verify documentation that I believe will significantly alter the court's understanding of this case." The word diplomatic sent a ripple of confusion through the gallery. Alexander's confident smirk began to waver as he tried to process what he was hearing. Diplomatic witnesses? What possible connection could his simple wife have to any foreign government? Marcus Stone immediately stood to object. "Your Honor, this appears to be a desperate stalling tactic. The defense has had months to prepare their case and present their evidence. If Mrs. Volkov had some kind of diplomatic status, surely that would have been disclosed during discovery." Peterson turned to look at Stone with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Mr. Stone, My client's diplomatic status was never disclosed because you never asked the right questions during discovery. Your investigation focused on her financial history and employment records, not on her legal citizenship or family background. Judge Holloway could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting like barometric pressure before a tornado. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear that this routine divorce case was about to become something much more complicated. Request granted, Mr. Peterson. We'll recess for 30 minutes to allow your witnesses to arrive. As the judge's gavel fell, Alexander turned to Marcus Stone with growing panic in his eyes. What the hell is happening here? What diplomatic witnesses? She's from some tiny village in Eastern Europe. What kind of diplomatic status could she possibly have? But Stone, for the first time in his career, had no answer. He could only watch as Anastasia Volkov sat calmly at the defense table, no longer looking like a victim but like someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment to arrive. The 30-minute recess stretched like an eternity for Alexander Donovan, who paced the courthouse hallway with the frantic energy of a caged predator sensing approaching danger. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor in an increasingly erratic rhythm as his mind raced through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Marcus Stone huddled with his legal team in an alcove near the water fountains, their hushed voices carrying an urgency that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "I need you to call our contact at the State Department immediately," Stone barked into his phone, his usual composure cracking like expensive veneer under pressure. "I need to know if there are any diplomatic flags on an Anastasia Volkov, Eastern European origin, possibly connected to, hell, I don't know what she's connected to, but find out everything you can in the next 20 minutes. Meanwhile, Anastasia remained seated in the courtroom, seemingly unperturbed by the chaos swirling around her. She had removed a small compact mirror from her purse and was calmly reapplying what appeared to be simple lip balm, though the careful observer might have noticed that her movements were precise and practiced in a way that suggested extensive training in personal presentation under pressure. Samuel Peterson sat beside her, no longer the bumbling old attorney, but a man whose entire demeanor had transformed into something sharp and dangerous. "Are you ready for this?" Peterson asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the hesitant quality it had possessed during the morning's proceedings. Anastasia closed the compact with a soft click and looked toward the courtroom doors. "I've been ready for 7 years, Samuel. The question is whether Alexander is ready for the truth. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it." At exactly 11:47 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom opened with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the building's foundations. The first person to enter was not the bailiff or another court official, but a man in a dark suit whose bearing and alertness immediately identified him as professional security. He was followed by a second man, then a third, each one moving with the coordinated precision of a team that had performed this ritual countless times before. But it was the fourth person to enter who caused the air to drain from the room as if a vacuum had been activated. Colonel Viktor Petrov of the Royal Guard of the Principality of Valdoria wore a uniform that belonged in a museum or a fairy tale, deep crimson wool with gold braiding, ceremonial sword at his side, and a chest full of ribbons that spoke of wars and honors that most Americans had never heard of. His salt and pepper beard was perfectly groomed, his posture was military straight, and his pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. The gallery, which had been buzzing with confused whispers during the recess, fell into complete silence. Alexander's business associates, who had been joking about his wife's pathetic legal strategy just minutes earlier, now stared open-mouthed at a scene that belonged in a movie about international espionage rather than a divorce court in downtown Chicago. Colonel Petrov approached the bench and executed a perfect military bow to Judge Holloway, who was staring at him with the expression of someone who had just discovered that her quiet Tuesday morning had transformed into something from a Tom Clancy novel. "Your Honor," the colonel said, his English accented with the precise diction of someone educated at Oxford or Cambridge, "I am Colonel Viktor Petrov, representing the interests of Her Royal Highness Princess Katerina Elizaveta Romanova of the Principality of Valdoria." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Alexander's face went through a series of color changes that would have been comical under different circumstances, from confusion to disbelief to a sickly shade of green that suggested his breakfast was reconsidering its location. Judge Holloway, who had presided over cases involving celebrities, politicians, and millionaires, had never had royalty in her courtroom. "Colonel, are you saying that the defendant in this case is—" "Her Royal Highness Princess Katerina Elizaveta Romanova, yes, Your Honor. Third in line to the throne of Valdoria and current head of the Romanova Trust, which manages assets valued at approximately 4 billion euros. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. 4 billion euros. Alexander's net worth of $150 million had just been revealed as pocket change in comparison to his wife's actual wealth. Marcus Stone, who had built his career on never being surprised in a courtroom, stood frozen at the plaintiff's table like a statue. His carefully prepared arguments about gold digging and asset protection had just become not only irrelevant but laughably inadequate. Colonel Petrov reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a document sealed with red wax and bearing a crest that looked like something from a medieval manuscript. "Your Honor, I present the official diplomatic credentials of Her Royal Highness, validated by the United States State Department and recognized under international law." Judge Holloway accepted the document with hands that trembled slightly. The seal was authentic. She could tell that much just from the quality of the paper and the weight of the wax. The letterhead bore the official insignia of the U.S. Department of State, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the Secretary of State himself. As the judge read the document, Anastasia slowly rose from her chair. The movement was simple, but something fundamental had changed about her bearing. Gone was the hesitant posture of the submissive wife. In its place was something that could only be described as regal, a way of holding herself that suggested she was accustomed to rooms full of people standing when she entered. She reached up and removed the simple elastic band that had held her hair in a modest ponytail, allowing her dark chestnut locks to fall past her shoulders. Then she removed her thick-rimmed glasses, revealing eyes that were not the uncertain brown that Alexander remembered, but a striking green that seemed to see everything and judge it with centuries of inherited authority. "Your Honor," Anastasia said, and her voice was no longer the soft, slightly accented English of a woman trying to fit into American society. It was the crisp, commanding tone of someone educated at the finest schools in Europe, someone who had been trained from birth to address parliaments and negotiate with world leaders. "I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary to protect both my safety and the interests of my government during what has become a rather complicated marriage." Alexander's world was collapsing in real time. The woman he had married, the woman he had treated as his intellectual and social inferior for 7 years, was not only vastly wealthier than he could ever hope to be, but was also a member of European royalty with diplomatic immunity and the backing of an entire nation. "This is impossible," Alexander whispered, though his voice carried clearly through the silent courtroom. She worked as a hostess. She clipped coupons. She shopped at thrift stores. Princess Katerina, for that was clearly her true identity now, turned to look at her husband for the first time since the proceedings had begun. Her expression held no anger, no triumph, only a sadness that seemed to carry the weight of 7 years of accumulated disappointments. "Yes, Alexander," she said softly. "I did all of those things because I wanted to build a life with a man who would love me for who I was as a person, not for the crown I was born to wear. I wanted to know what it felt like to be valued for my character rather than my inheritance." The courtroom remained frozen as the full implications of the revelation began to sink in. Alexander Donovan, who had spent the morning planning to destroy his poor, helpless wife, had just discovered that he was married to one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the world, a woman who had been living in disguise for 7 years while he planned her humiliation. And as Colonel Petrov stood at attention beside the bench, his hand resting casually on the pommel of his ceremonial sword, it became clear that the game Alexander thought he had been playing was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. The silence that followed Princess Katerina's revelation was so complete that the sound of Alexander's Rolex ticking seemed to echo through the courtroom like a countdown to his own destruction. Judge Holloway set down the diplomatic credentials with the careful precision of someone handling a live explosive, her eyes moving between the woman she had known as Anastasia Volkov and the military officer who stood at attention beside her bench. Marcus Stone, whose legendary composure had carried him through decades of high-stakes litigation, found himself experiencing something entirely foreign to his professional existence: complete and total bewilderment. The prenuptial agreement that had been his trump card lay scattered across the plaintiff's table like confetti from a celebration he was no longer invited to attend. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to form words. "Your Honor," Stone finally managed, his voice carrying none of its usual authority, This changes nothing. A prenuptial agreement is binding regardless of the party's true net worth. The law doesn't discriminate based on royal titles or diplomatic status." Samuel Peterson rose from the defense table with the fluid grace of a man 30 years younger than his appearance suggested. The transformation in his demeanor was complete now. Gone was the bumbling elderly attorney, replaced by someone whose every movement suggested decades of experience in the most elite legal circles of the world. "Mr. Stone raises an interesting point about the prenuptial agreement," Peterson said, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement that made Alexander's blood run cold. "However, I believe there are several factors that the court should consider before determining the validity of that document." Peterson approached the bench carrying a leather portfolio that looked far more expensive than anything he had displayed earlier. "Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement that Mr. Stone is so eager to enforce contains several clauses that become rather problematic when viewed in light of my client's true identity and the circumstances under which the agreement was signed." Judge Holloway leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued despite the surreal nature of the proceedings. "Please elaborate, Mr. Peterson." "First," Peterson said, opening his portfolio with practiced precision, "there is the matter of informed consent. Mr. Donovan insisted that my client sign this agreement without providing her adequate time for legal review, claiming it was merely a formality. More importantly, he failed to disclose several material facts about his own financial situation that render the agreement voidable under Illinois law." Alexander felt the first real stab of fear pierce through his shock and confusion. "What material facts?" "I disclosed everything I was required to disclose." Peterson smiled with the patience of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. "Mr. Donovan, you disclosed your legitimate assets and income. However, you failed to mention the substantial debts you had accumulated through illegal activities, nor did you disclose your intention to use the marriage as a cover for money laundering operations." The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Alexander shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward against the wooden rail. "That's a lie. I never used our marriage for money laundering. I run a legitimate real estate development business." "Do you?" Peterson asked mildly, reaching into his portfolio again. "Because the financial records that Her Royal Highness has been meticulously gathering for the past 3 years tell a rather different story." Princess Katerina stood and walked to the evidence table with the measured pace of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Gone entirely was the hesitant, self-effacing woman who had entered the courtroom that morning. In her place was someone whose bearing suggested she was accustomed to commanding rooms full of world leaders and international financiers. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the clear authority of someone born to power, "during our marriage, I discovered that my husband's business practices included systematic bribery of city officials, tax evasion through offshore shell companies, and the use of construction loans to fund personal expenses and gifts for his mistresses." She placed a thick stack of documents on the evidence table. "These are copies of bank records, recorded phone conversations, and photographic evidence of illegal transactions spanning the past 5 years. I have been working with federal investigators to document these crimes as part of an ongoing RICO investigation into corruption in Chicago's construction and real estate industries." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. RICO investigation. Federal investigators. The words swirled in his mind like a toxic fog that made it impossible to think clearly. "You've been spying on me? For 3 years, you've been spying on me." "I've been documenting criminal activity," Katerina corrected, her tone suggesting the kind of moral clarity that comes from centuries of royal breeding. "Activity that not only violates federal law but also directly contradicts the financial disclosures you made when insisting I sign your prenuptial agreement." Peterson stepped forward again, and Judge Holloway noticed that his entire legal team, which had seemed so small and overwhelmed earlier, had somehow multiplied. 3 additional attorneys had quietly entered the courtroom during the chaos, each one carrying briefcases that suggested resources far beyond what a small family law practice should possess. "Your Honor," Peterson continued, "under Illinois law, a prenuptial agreement becomes voidable if one party fails to disclose material financial information or if the agreement was signed under duress or misrepresentation. Mr. Donovan's failure to disclose his criminal debts and his insistence that my client sign without legal review clearly constitute grounds for voiding the agreement." But Peterson wasn't finished. "Furthermore, there is the matter of the assets themselves. Mr. Donovan's real estate empire, which forms the bulk of his claimed net worth, was built using illegally obtained loans and bribes. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, these properties are subject to seizure as proceeds of criminal activity." Marcus Stone, who had been silent during this exchange, finally found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unproven allegations. Mr. Donovan has never been charged with any crime, much less convicted." "Actually," a new voice said from the back of the courtroom, "that's about to change." Every head in the room turned toward the source of the voice. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stood in the doorway, her badge clearly visible on her dark suit jacket. Behind her were 4 additional agents, all wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested they weren't there to observe the proceedings. "Mr. Alexander Donovan," Agent Martinez said, walking down the center aisle of the courtroom, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, bribery of public officials, tax evasion, and racketeering under the RICO Act." Alexander's legs gave out, and he collapsed back into his chair as if someone had cut his strings. The expensive suit that had been his armor that morning now felt like a costume from a play that had suddenly turned into a nightmare. "This isn't possible," he whispered, though whether he was talking to his lawyer, his wife, or himself was unclear. "This can't be happening." Princess Katerina walked over to where her husband sat in stunned silence. For a moment, her regal bearing softened, and something that might have been sadness flickered across her features. "7 years ago," she said quietly, "I fell in love with a man I met in a jazz club. A man who seemed kind and ambitious and genuine. I gave up my title, my security, my entire life to build something real with that man." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of accumulated disappointments and broken promises. "But that man was an illusion, Alexander. The real you, the man who steals from families, who bribes officials, who treats service workers like they're invisible, that man I could never love. That man I could never allow to continue destroying innocent lives." As the FBI agents moved to place Alexander in handcuffs, the full scope of his situation began to crystallize in his mind. He wasn't just losing his wife or his assets. He was losing his freedom, his reputation, and everything he had built over the past 15 years. And it had all been orchestrated by the woman he had spent 7 years treating as his intellectual inferior. The prenuptial agreement that was supposed to protect his wealth had become irrelevant. The wealth itself, built on a foundation of criminal activity, was about to disappear into federal evidence lockers. And the wife he had planned to humiliate and discard had revealed herself to be not only beyond his reach, but powerful enough to destroy him completely. The metallic click of handcuffs echoing through courtroom 7B seemed to trigger a cascade of chaos that had been building like pressure behind a dam for the past hour. Alexander Donovan, who had entered the courthouse that morning as one of Chicago's most powerful real estate moguls, now sat slumped in federal custody while his entire world collapsed around him with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. Agent Martinez read him his rights in the steady, professional tone of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times before, but the words seemed to bounce off Alexander like rain on glass. His mind was stuck in an endless loop, trying to process how the meek woman he had planned to destroy had orchestrated his complete annihilation with the efficiency of a military operation. Marcus Stone, whose reputation had been built on never being caught off guard, found himself in the unprecedented position of watching his client being arrested during active divorce proceedings. His legal team scattered like startled birds, some frantically making phone calls to their contacts in federal law enforcement, others trying to distance themselves from what was clearly about to become a major criminal case that would dominate headlines for months. "Your Honor," Stone managed, his voice lacking any of its usual commanding authority, "I request an immediate recess so that I can consult with my client regarding these new developments." Judge Holloway looked down at the scene before her with the expression of someone who had just discovered that her quiet Tuesday morning had transformed into the legal equivalent of a natural disaster. "Mr. Stone, your client is in federal custody. I believe consultation will need to wait until after he's been processed and arraigned on these charges." Meanwhile, Scarlett Hayes, Alexander's Instagram influencer mistress who had been sitting in the gallery enjoying what she thought would be her wealthy boyfriend's easy victory, was experiencing her own moment of terrible clarity. The news crews that had begun gathering outside the courthouse weren't there to cover a routine divorce. They were there because the FBI had just arrested one of Chicago's most prominent businessmen on federal racketeering charges. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications as her Instagram followers began connecting the dots between her recent posts about her mysterious wealthy boyfriend and the breaking news alerts about Alexander's arrest. The penthouse apartment he had bought for her, the jewelry, the exotic vacations, all of it had been purchased with money stolen from construction funds and bribes paid to corrupt city officials. Scarlett bolted from the gallery, pushing past reporters and court officials in her designer heels, her mind racing through damage control scenarios. But as she reached the courthouse steps, she found herself face to face with Agent Martinez's partner, Agent James Rodriguez, who had been waiting outside specifically for her arrival. "Ms. Hayes," Agent Rodriguez said, his tone polite but firm, "we'd like to ask you some questions about gifts and payments you received from Mr. Donovan over the past 18 months. Specifically, we're interested in your knowledge of how those gifts were funded." Inside the courtroom, Princess Katerina stood before the bench with the composed dignity of someone who had just completed a task that required years of careful planning and perfect execution. The transformation from submissive housewife to royal authority figure was now complete, and everyone present could see that this had been the real Katerina all along. The other persona had been nothing more than an elaborate performance. "Your Honor," Samuel Peterson said, "in light of these developments, I believe we need to address the immediate practical matters arising from Mr. Donovan's arrest and the revelation of his criminal activities." Peterson gestured toward Colonel Petrov, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio bearing the official seal of the Principality of Valdoria. "The Romanova Trust has been monitoring Mr. Donovan's activities for the past 2 years as part of their due diligence regarding Her Royal Highness's safety and security. During this investigation, we discovered that Mr. Donovan had been using marital assets to fund illegal activities." Judge Holloway accepted another set of documents from the colonel, these bearing the letterhead of several major international banks. "What exactly am I looking at here, Colonel?" "Financial records showing that Mr. Donovan has been laundering money through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and Switzerland," Colonel Petrov explained. "More significantly, these records show that he has been using funds borrowed against properties owned jointly with Her Royal Highness to pay bribes and fund illegal construction projects." The implications hit Judge Holloway like a physical force. "Are you saying that the princess's assets have been used as collateral for illegal activities without her knowledge or consent?" "That is exactly what we are saying, Your Honor," Peterson confirmed. "Which means that under both Illinois law and international banking regulations, Her Royal Highness has grounds to demand immediate repayment of those loans, plus damages for the unauthorized use of her assets in criminal activities." Alexander, who had been sitting in stunned silence while the FBI agents prepared to transport him to federal detention, suddenly jerked upright in his chair. "What do you mean, her assets? Everything we own is joint property under Illinois law." She can't claim ownership of. Actually, Princess Katerina interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests with surgical precision, I can. Because while you were busy committing federal crimes, I was quietly documenting every illegal transaction and transferring legitimate assets into accounts that you never knew existed. She turned to address Judge Holloway directly. Your Honor, I have been working with international banking authorities for the past 18 months to separate my legitimate assets from my husband's criminal enterprises. As of this morning, every property, bank account, and investment that was purchased with clean money has been transferred into trust accounts controlled by the Romanova estate. The mathematical reality of Alexander's situation was beginning to crystallize in horrifying detail. Not only was he facing decades in federal prison, but the assets he had planned to protect through the prenuptial agreement were either the proceeds of criminal activity, and therefore subject to federal seizure, or legitimate assets that Princess Katerina had legally reclaimed through international banking procedures. Peterson opened another folder and withdrew what appeared to be a property deed. For example, the penthouse apartment that Mr. Donovan purchased for Ms. Hayes was bought using a construction loan secured against property that actually belongs to the Romanova Trust. Since the loan was obtained through fraudulent means, the trust is exercising its right to immediate foreclosure and asset recovery. You're taking the apartment? Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper. We're taking everything that was bought with stolen money or used as collateral for illegal loans, Princess Katerina replied. Which, unfortunately for you, appears to be approximately 97% of your claimed assets. Agent Martinez's radio crackled to life, and she stepped aside to take the communication. When she returned, her expression suggested that Alexander's day was about to get significantly worse. Mr. Donovan, she said, I've just received word that federal agents are executing search warrants on your office building, your penthouse, and 3 of your construction sites. We've also frozen all bank accounts associated with Donovan Development Group pending investigation. The words hit Alexander like physical blows. His office, his home, his construction projects. Everything that had defined his identity for the past 15 years was being systematically dismantled by federal agents while he sat helpless in handcuffs. But perhaps the most devastating blow came when Princess Katerina walked over to where he sat and looked down at him with an expression that held no anger, no triumph, only a profound sadness that somehow hurt worse than rage would have. Do you know what the tragedy is, Alexander? She asked softly. 7 years ago, I really did love you. I loved the man I thought you were, kind, ambitious, hard-working. I gave up a kingdom to be with that man. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of accumulated disappointments that had been building for years. But that man was never real, was he? You were always this person. Someone who steals from working families, who bribes officials, who treats people as disposable objects for your entertainment. The only difference is that now everyone else can see what I've been living with for 7 years. As the FBI agents prepared to escort Alexander from the courtroom, the final piece of his destruction fell into place. The prenuptial agreement that was supposed to protect his wealth had become meaningless because the wealth itself had been built on criminal foundations. The wife he had planned to humiliate and discard had revealed herself to be not only beyond his reach but powerful enough to orchestrate his complete downfall. And in the cruelest irony of all, the woman he had spent 7 years treating as his intellectual and social inferior had been conducting a years-long investigation that would likely send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. The federal courthouse's holding cell where Alexander spent the next 6 hours was a far cry from the luxury he had grown accustomed to over the past 15 years. The concrete walls were painted institutional green, the fluorescent lighting flickered intermittently, and the metal bench was deliberately uncomfortable to discourage extended stays. But Alexander barely noticed his surroundings. His mind was trapped in an endless loop of disbelief and growing terror as the full scope of his situation crystallized with horrifying clarity. His arraignment hearing had been a masterclass in legal humiliation. Federal prosecutor Margaret Chen had outlined the charges against him with the methodical precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy. 18 counts of money laundering, 12 counts of bribery of public officials, 6 counts of tax evasion, and one overarching RICO conspiracy charge that tied all of his criminal activities together into a single, devastating narrative of corruption that spanned nearly a decade. The bail hearing had been even worse. When Alexander's temporary counsel had requested reasonable bail, arguing that his client was a prominent businessman with ties to the community, Princess Katerina had quietly risen from her seat in the gallery and approached the bench. The federal judge, the Honorable Robert Kim, had listened with growing amazement as she presented evidence that Alexander had been planning to flee the country using a false passport hidden in a safety deposit box in the Cayman Islands. "Your Honor," she had said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to addressing world leaders, "my husband has been systematically moving assets offshore for the past 6 months. He has maintained residences in 3 non-extradition countries and has been in contact with individuals who specialize in helping wealthy criminals disappear." She had placed a folder on the prosecutor's table containing photographs, bank transfers, and recorded phone conversations that painted a picture of a man who had been planning his escape long before his crimes were discovered. The evidence was so comprehensive and damaging that Judge Kim had denied bail entirely, ordering Alexander to be held in federal detention pending trial. The phone call Alexander was allowed to make from the holding cell had been another exercise in devastating reality. He had called his office, hoping that his assistant could begin damage control and possibly arrange for competent legal representation. Instead, he had reached a recorded message informing him that the offices of Donovan Development Group had been sealed by federal agents and that all business operations had been suspended pending investigation. His second call had been to his accountant, hoping to understand how much of his wealth might survive the federal asset seizure. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes before his accountant, a man who had helped him hide millions in offshore accounts, had abruptly hung up after explaining that he had retained his own criminal defense attorney and could no longer discuss Alexander's financial affairs. Meanwhile, across the city in the penthouse that had once been Alexander's pride and joy, federal agents were conducting the most thorough search of his life with the systematic efficiency of an archaeological expedition. Every document, every electronic device, every hidden safe was being catalogued and analyzed. The agents had discovered evidence of crimes that even Princess Katerina hadn't known about, including an elaborate tax fraud scheme that had cost the federal government more than $8 million in lost revenue. The penthouse itself had become a crime scene, with yellow tape blocking access to the home that Alexander had spent 3 years and $12 million creating as a monument to his success. His wine collection, worth nearly $2 million, had been photographed and tagged as potential evidence of money laundering. His art collection, including several pieces by renowned contemporary artists, was being evaluated to determine whether they had been purchased with illegal funds. But perhaps the most devastating blow came when federal agents discovered Alexander's personal safe, hidden behind a false wall in his home office. Inside, they found not just cash and jewelry, but detailed records that Alexander had kept of every bribe he had paid, every official he had corrupted, and every law he had broken. The man's arrogance had been so complete that he had actually maintained written documentation of his crimes, apparently believing that he was too powerful and well-connected to ever face consequences. At the federal detention center, Alexander's cellmate was a former city councilman who had been arrested 3 months earlier on similar corruption charges. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Alexander had likely paid bribes to this very councilman during his real estate ventures, and now they were sharing a 12 by 8-foot cell while awaiting trial for related crimes. "You're the real estate guy, right?" the former councilman asked during their first night together. "The one who got taken down by his own wife?" Alexander nodded miserably, staring at the ceiling while lying on a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with concrete. She was supposed to be nobody. Just a simple girl from Eastern Europe who was grateful to marry an American businessman. His cellmate laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Yeah, well, my wife was supposed to be loyal too. Turns out she was the one who gave the FBI recordings of me discussing your bribes. Women, right? Can't trust them." But Alexander was beginning to understand that trust had nothing to do with his situation. Princess Katerina hadn't betrayed him. She had simply revealed who she really was after 7 years of watching him reveal who he really was. The woman he had married hadn't changed. He had simply never bothered to look beneath the surface of her carefully constructed persona. The next morning brought a visit from his court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named David Rodriguez who looked like he had just graduated from law school the previous week. Rodriguez had spent the night reviewing Alexander's case files, and his expression suggested that he had drawn the legal equivalent of a losing lottery ticket. "Mr. Donovan," Rodriguez said, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from Alexander in the detention center's attorney meeting room, "I'm going to be direct with you about your situation, because I don't think anyone else has been completely honest about what you're facing." Rodriguez opened a thick folder filled with legal documents and evidence photographs. "The federal prosecutor's case against you is, frankly, overwhelming. They have bank records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence, and cooperating witnesses who can testify about specific instances of bribery and money laundering. Worse still, they have your own written records documenting these activities." Alexander slumped in his chair as the attorney continued. "The RICO charges alone carry a potential sentence of 20 years. Add in the money laundering, tax evasion, and bribery charges, and you're looking at a potential sentence of 60 to 80 years in federal prison." The numbers hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Alexander was 39 years old. Even with good behavior and early release, he would likely die in federal prison. What about a plea deal? Alexander asked desperately. "I can provide information about other corrupt officials, other real estate developers who are doing the same things I did." Rodriguez shook his head sadly. "Mr. Donovan, the prosecutors don't need your cooperation. Your wife, excuse me, Princess Katerina, has already provided them with evidence against dozens of other individuals involved in Chicago's construction corruption network. Her investigation was so thorough that the FBI expects to make more than 50 additional arrests over the next 6 months." The final devastating blow came when Rodriguez explained the asset forfeiture process. "Every property, every bank account, every investment that can be connected to your criminal activities will be seized by the federal government. Based on the preliminary asset review, you'll be left with approximately $47,000 in a checking account that appears to contain only legitimate earnings from before your criminal activities began." From multimillionaire to federal prisoner with less than $50,000 to his name. The transformation was so complete and devastating that Alexander almost couldn't comprehend it. 7 years earlier, he had been worth $20 million and married to a woman he thought worshipped him. Now he was facing life in prison while that same woman revealed herself to be worth €4 billion and powerful enough to destroy him completely. The irony was almost poetic in its completeness. Alexander had spent 7 years treating Princess Katerina as his intellectual and social inferior, never realizing that she was conducting an investigation that would ultimately expose the largest construction corruption network in Chicago's history. The woman he had planned to humiliate and discard had orchestrated his complete destruction while maintaining the perfect facade of the grateful, submissive wife. And as Alexander sat in his federal holding cell, contemplating a future that stretched endlessly toward a lonely death in prison, he finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. He hadn't just underestimated his wife. He had failed to recognize that he was playing a game against someone who had been born and trained to win at a level he couldn't even comprehend. 3 years after the courthouse revelation that destroyed Alexander Donovan's life, the Metropolitan Correctional Center in downtown Chicago had become his permanent address and the boundaries of his diminished world. Federal inmate number 47291 spent his days in the prison laundry facility, operating industrial washing machines that cleaned the uniforms of guards and fellow prisoners with the mechanical precision of someone who had given up hope of ever doing anything else. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once employed dozens of housekeepers and cleaning staff now spent 8 hours a day doing the exact type of domestic labor he had always considered beneath his notice. His hands, once manicured and soft from expensive treatments, were now permanently stained with industrial detergent and scarred from countless minor injuries sustained while learning to operate machinery he had never imagined he would need to understand. The federal trial had been a spectacle that dominated Chicago news for 6 months. Every major newspaper and television station had covered the proceedings, not just because of the scope of Alexander's crimes, but because of the extraordinary revelation that his wife was European royalty who had spent years documenting his illegal activities. The story had everything that media executives dreamed of: wealth, power, betrayal, international intrigue, and a reversal of fortunes so complete that it seemed like something from a Hollywood screenplay. Alexander's conviction on all counts had surprised absolutely no one who had followed the trial. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his defense attorney had essentially argued for mercy rather than innocence. The judge had sentenced him to 75 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, effectively a death sentence for a man who was barely 40 years old when he was convicted. But it wasn't just Alexander who had been destroyed by the investigation that Princess Katerina had initiated. Her evidence had led to the largest corruption investigation in Chicago's history, resulting in the arrest and conviction of 47 city officials, 32 real estate developers, and dozens of construction company executives. The entire power structure that had controlled Chicago's development industry for decades had been systematically dismantled through information that she had gathered while playing the role of the submissive housewife. The federal authorities had recovered over $400 million in stolen funds and bribes, returning much of it to the city programs and working families that had been defrauded by the corruption network. Princess Katerina had personally established a victims' compensation fund using money from the Romanova Trust, ensuring that families who had been displaced by Alexander's illegal construction projects received new housing and financial support. Meanwhile, Scarlett Hayes had discovered that her association with Alexander Donovan had consequences that extended far beyond losing access to his credit cards and penthouse apartment. The FBI investigation had revealed that she had knowingly received gifts purchased with stolen funds, making her legally liable for receipt of proceeds from criminal activity. She had ultimately been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $2.3 million. Money she didn't have and would likely spend the rest of her life trying to repay. Her social media career had evaporated overnight when her followers learned that her luxury lifestyle had been funded by money stolen from working families. The brands that had once paid her to promote their products now wanted nothing to do with someone whose name had become synonymous with corruption and greed. She had been released from prison 8 months earlier and was currently working as a cashier at a discount grocery store in suburban Milwaukee, living in a studio apartment and trying to rebuild a life that bore no resemblance to the Instagram fantasy she had once curated. But the most dramatic transformation belonged to Princess Katerina herself. After the trial concluded, she had gradually resumed her royal duties and responsibilities, though she had chosen to remain based in Chicago rather than returning to Europe. The Romanova Trust had purchased Alexander's former office building and converted it into a non-profit center focused on affordable housing development and workers' rights advocacy. Her work had attracted international attention from organizations dedicated to fighting corruption and supporting victims of economic exploitation. She had testified before Congress about the need for stronger oversight of real estate development and had worked with federal agencies to develop new protocols for investigating financial crimes. The quiet woman who had spent 7 years clipping coupons and doing laundry had emerged as one of the most influential voices in the fight against systemic corruption. On a cold Tuesday morning in December, Princess Katerina made an unexpected visit to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. It was the first time she had seen Alexander since the day of his sentencing 3 years earlier, and the transformation in both of them was striking. Where she had once appeared diminished and uncertain, she now carried herself with the natural authority of someone comfortable exercising real power in the world. Where Alexander had once projected arrogance and dominance, he now looked like exactly what he had become, a broken man serving a life sentence for crimes that had destroyed countless innocent lives. They met in the prison's attorney consultation room, separated by reinforced glass and communicating through phones that were monitored and recorded by prison officials. Alexander had requested the meeting through his attorney, though he had never explained what he hoped to accomplish by seeing the woman who had orchestrated his destruction. "You look well," Alexander said when she picked up the phone, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority it had once possessed. Prison had aged him dramatically. His hair was now gray at the temples, his face was lined with stress and regret, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had lost everything that had once defined his identity. "Thank you," Princess Katerina replied, her voice calm and measured. She was wearing a simple navy suit that somehow managed to project both elegance and authority, and her bearing suggested someone who had found peace with difficult decisions. "You asked to see me, Alexander. What did you want to discuss?" Alexander stared at her through the glass for a long moment before speaking. "I need to understand something. 7 years. You spent 7 years documenting my crimes, building a case against me, planning my destruction. Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you divorce me quietly and return to your royal life?" Princess Katerina considered the question carefully before responding. "Because leaving wouldn't have stopped you from hurting other people. In the 3 years since your conviction, the families you displaced have received new housing. The workers you cheated have recovered their stolen wages. The city officials you corrupted have been removed from power. Simply divorcing you would have allowed all of that harm to continue. So this was never about our marriage," Alexander said, his voice bitter with understanding. "This was about justice for people you'd never met." "No," she replied, and for the first time during their conversation, her voice softened slightly. "It started being about our marriage. I really did love the man I thought you were when we met. But as I learned who you really were, as I watched you destroy families and communities for profit, it became about something larger than just my personal feelings." Alexander slumped in his chair as the full weight of her words settled over him. "You could have had anything, Katerina. Palaces, kingdoms, unlimited wealth and power. Instead, you chose to spend 7 years married to a criminal so you could bring him to justice. I don't understand that kind of sacrifice." Princess Katerina smiled sadly. "That's exactly the problem, Alexander. You never understood sacrifice, or justice, or love that isn't based on what someone can do for you. You saw me as an accessory to your success rather than as a person with my own values and responsibilities." She paused, looking at the man who had once been her husband with an expression that held no anger, only a profound sadness for opportunities that had been lost forever. "7 years ago, I would have given up my crown to build a real life with you. But the man I fell in love with was an illusion. The real Alexander Donovan was always the person sitting in that cell, and I couldn't allow that person to continue destroying innocent lives while I turned away and pretended not to see." As their conversation ended and Princess Katerina prepared to leave, Alexander finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. He hadn't just lost his freedom, his wealth, or his status. He had lost the love of a woman who would have sacrificed a kingdom for him if only he had been worthy of that sacrifice. The woman who walked away from the Metropolitan Correctional Center that December morning was someone who had chosen justice over comfort, duty over personal happiness, and the protection of innocent families over the preservation of her own security. Alexander Donovan would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, but Princess Katerina Elizaveta Romanova would spend hers building a better world from the ashes of his destruction. And in the end, that was perhaps the most fitting punishment of all, not just that he had lost everything, but that he had finally learned to recognize the value of what he had thrown away. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.